Vietnam, the smaller dragon. While the Korean people were attempting to establish their own identity in the shadow of the powerful Chinese Empire, the peoples of Vietnam on China's southern frontier were seeking to do the same. The Vietnamese, known as the Hue in Chinese from the peoples of that name inhabiting the southeastern coast of the mainland China, began to practice irrigated agriculture in the flooded regions of the Red River Delta at an early date and entered the Bronze Age sometime during the second millennium BCE. By around 200 BCE, a young state had begun to form in the area, but immediately encountered the expanding power of the Qin Empire in China. Of course, the Vietnamese were not easy to subdue, however, and the collapse of the Qin dynasty temporarily enabled them to preserve their independence. Nevertheless, a century later, they were absorbed into the Han Empire of China. At first, the Han were satisfied to rule the Delta as an autonomous region under the administration of the local landed aristocracy, but Chinese taxes were oppressive, and in 39 CE, a revolt led by the Trung sisters, widows of local nobles who had been executed by the Chinese, briefly brought Han rule to an end. The Chinese soon suppressed the rebellion, however, and began to rule the area directly through officials dispatched from China. The first Chinese officials to serve in the region became exasperated at the uncultured ways of the locals, who wandered around naked without shame. In time, however, these foreign officials began to intermarry with the local nobility and form a Sino-Vietnamese ruling class who, though trained in Chinese culture, began to identify with the cause of the Vietnamese autonomy. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vietnamese were exposed to the art, architecture, literature, and philosophy, written language of China, as the Chinese attempted to integrate the area culturally, as well as politically and administratively, into their empire. It was a classic example of the Chinese effort to introduce advanced Confucian civilization to the backward peoples along the perimeter. To all intents and purposes, the Red River Delta, then known to the Chinese as the Pacified South or Annam, became part of China. Despite Chinese efforts to assimilate Vietnam, the Vietnamese sense of ethnic and cultural identity proved inextinguishable, and in the year 939, the Vietnamese took advantage of the collapse of the Tang dynasty in China to overthrow the Chinese rule there. The new Vietnamese state, which called itself Dai Viet, or Great Viet, became a dynamic new force on the southeast Asian mainland. As the population of the Red River Delta expanded, Dai Viet, or Dai Viet, soon came into conflict with Champa, its neighbor to the south. Located along the central coast of modern Vietnam, Champa was a trading society based on Indian cultural traditions that had been established earlier in the year 192 CE. And over the next several centuries, the two states fought on numerous occasions, and finally in the year 1471, Dai Viet, or Dai Viet, succeeded in conquering Champa. The Vietnamese then resumed their march southward, establishing agricultural settlements in the newly conquered territory, and by the 17th century, the Vietnamese had reached the Gulf of Siam. And so the Dai Viet, or Great Viet, was born. The Vietnamese faced an even more serious challenge from the north. The Song dynasty in China, beset with its own problems on the northern frontier, eventually accepted the Dai Viet rulers' offer of tribute status, but later dynasties attempted to reintegrate the Red River Delta into the Chinese Empire. And the first effort was made in the late 13th century by the Mongols, who attempted on 2 occasions to conquer the Vietnamese. After a series of bloody battles in the 13th century, during which the Vietnamese displayed an impressive capacity for guerrilla warfare, the invaders were driven out, and a little over a century later, the Ming dynasty tried again in China, and for 20 years Vietnam was once more under Chinese rule. In the year 1428, however, the Vietnamese evicted the Chinese again, but the experience had contributed to the strong sense of Vietnamese identity. the Chinese legacy, and despite their stubborn resistance to Chinese rule after the restoration of independence in the 10th century, Vietnamese rulers quickly discovered the convenience of the Confucian model in administering a river valley society and therefore attempted to follow Chinese practice in forming their own state. The ruler styled himself an emperor like his counterpart to the north, although he prudently termed himself a king in his direct dealings with the Chinese court, adopted Chinese court rituals, claimed the mandate of heaven, and arrogated to himself the same authority and privileges in his dealings with his subjects. But unlike a Chinese emperor, who had no particular symbolic role as defender of the Chinese people or Chinese culture, a Vietnamese monarch was viewed above all as the symbol and defender of Vietnamese independence. And like their Chinese counterparts, Vietnamese rulers fought to preserve their authority from the challenges of powerful aristocratic families and turned to the Chinese bureaucratic model, including civil service exams, as a means of doing so. Under the pressure of strong monarchs, the concept of merit eventually took hold, and the power of the landed aristocracy was weakened, if not entirely broken. The Vietnamese adopted much of the Chinese administrative structure, including the 6 ministries, the censorate, and the various levels of provincial and local administration. Another aspect of the Chinese legacy was the spread of Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian ideas, which supplemented the traditional belief in nature, spirits. Buddhist precepts became popular among the local population, who integrated the new faith into their existing belief system in nature spirits by founding Buddhist temples dedicated to the local village deity in the hope of guaranteeing an abundant harvest. Upper-class Vietnamese educated in the Confucian classics tended to follow the more agnostic Confucian doctrine, but some joined Buddhist monasteries. Taoism also flourished at all levels of society and, as in China, provided a structure for animistic beliefs and practices that still predominate at the village level today. Of course, during the early period of independence, Vietnamese culture also borrowed liberally from its larger neighbor. Educated Vietnamese tried their hand at Chinese poetry, wrote dynastic histories in the Chinese style, and followed Chinese models in sculpture, architecture, and porcelain. Many of the notable buildings of the medieval period, such as the Temple of Literature and the famous one-pillar pagoda in Hanoi, are classic examples of Chinese architecture in Vietnam, but there were signs that Vietnamese creativity would eventually transcend the bounds of Chinese cultural normalities. Although most classical writing was undertaken in literary Chinese, the only form of literary expression deemed suitable by Confucian conservatives, an adaptation of Chinese written characters called Chunam, or Southern characters, was devised to provide a written system for spoken Vietnamese. In use by the early 9th century, it eventually began to be used for the composition of essays and poetry in the Vietnamese language. Such pioneering efforts would lead in latter centuries to the emergence of a vigorous national literature totally independent of Chinese forms. And then we have society and family life in early Vietnam, the smaller dragon. Vietnamese social institutions and customs were also strongly influenced by those of China, as has been said before. And as in China, the introduction of a Confucian system and the adoption of civil service exams undermined the role of the old landed aristocrats and led eventually to their replacement by the scholar gentry class. Also, as in China, the examinations were open to most males, regardless of family background, which opened the door to a degree of social mobility unknown in most of the other states in the region. Candidates for the bureaucracy read many of the same Confucian classics and absorbed the same ethical principles as their counterparts in China. And at the same time, they were also exposed to the classic works of Vietnamese history, which strengthened their sense that Vietnam was a distinct culture similar to but separate from that of China. The vast majority of the Vietnamese people, however, were peasants, and most were small landholders or sharecroppers who rented their plots from wealthier farmers, but large estates were rare due to the systematic efforts of the central government to prevent the rise of a powerful local landed elite. Family life in Vietnam was similar in many respects to that of China, the peasant life. Of course, the Confucian concept of family took hold during the period of Chinese rule, along with the related concepts of filial piety and gender inequality. Perhaps the most striking difference between family traditions in China and that of Vietnam was that Vietnamese women possessed more rights both in practice and by law. Since ancient times, wives had been permitted to own property and initiate divorce proceedings. One consequence of Chinese rule was a growing emphasis on male dominance, but the tradition of women's rights was never totally extinguished and was legally recognized in a law code promulgated in 1460. Moreover, Vietnam had a strong historical tradition associating heroic women with defense of the homeland. The Trung sisters were the first, but by no means the only example. In the following, a Vietnamese historian of the 18th century recounts their story. Quote, the imperial court was far away, local officials were greedy and oppressive. At that time, the country of 1,100 sons was the country of the women of the Lord Tu. And ladies, or the Trung sisters, used the female arts against their irreconcilable foe. Skirts and hairpins sang of patriotic righteousness. Uttered a solemn oath at the inner door of the ladies' quarters, expelled the governor and seized the capital. Were they not grand heroines? Our two ladies brought forward an army of all the people, and establishing a royal court that settled affairs in the territories of the 65 strongholds, shook their skirts over the 100 Vietnamese people. And so we've already gone over the formation of the Japanese state, as well as early Korea and Vietnam. Now we're going to move to the making of Europe, beginning with the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III, as depicted in a medieval French manuscript. So we're talking about the emergence of Europe in the early Middle Ages. We'll talk about Europe in the High Middle Ages, and then we'll just talk about medieval Europe in general and the rest of the world in particular. So the early Middle Ages from around 300 to 1000, the Dark Age. The High Middle Ages, Age of Feudalism, around 1000 or 1000 CE to 1300 CE. And then the Late Middle Ages, from around the time of the Renaissance, from around the big dawn of the 14th century to the dawn of the 16th century, respectively.